Une lecture de l'Évangile de Matthieu. Alors le roi dira à ceux qui seront à sa droite, « Venez vous, qui êtes bénis par mon Père, prenez possession du royaume qui vous a été préparé dès la création du monde. En effet, j'ai eu faim et vous m'avez donné à manger. J'ai eu soif et vous m'avez donné à boire. J'étais étranger et vous m'avez accueilli. J'étais nu et vous m'avez habillé. J'étais malade et vous m'avez rendu visite. J'étais en prison et vous êtes venus vers moi. » Les justes lui répondront, « Seigneur, quand avons-nous vu affamé et t'avons-nous donné à manger, ou assoiffé et t'avons-nous donné à boire? Quand avons-nous vu étranger et t'avons-nous accueilli, ou nu et t'avons-nous habillé? Quand avons-nous vu malade ou en prison et sommes-nous allés vers toi? » Et le roi leur répondra, « Je vous le dis en vérité, toutes les fois que vous avez fait cela à l'un de ces petits de mes frères, c'est à moi que vous l'avez fait. » Acclamons la parole de Dieu.
All right, thank you. And it's such an honor to be here this morning. Thank you for the warm welcome and the beautiful singing. It's so lovely to be in this space with each of you. As Chris mentioned, Action Réfugiés Montreal receives support from the Anglican Diocese of Montreal, churches like this one, as well as the Presbyterian Church in Canada, a wide variety of individuals, organizations, and religious congregations. So I mentioned some of the work that I do. I'm also a member at St. James United Church downtown in Montreal, and grew up going to church, but I'm not ordained myself. But I'm happy to share some thoughts and words with you today. Just a brief word of prayer. Lord, may the words that I say and the reflections they provoke be pleasing to you and consistent with your teachings. Amen. So I want to talk today about hospitality and about welcome. And my goal here is to talk about this at two different levels. One is about how we welcome one another, just as you have welcomed me here today. And then at maybe a broader level, how our country or how nations are welcoming or not to other people, to people who wish to come here and reside alongside us. And so perhaps we can say we're discussing an individual welcome and then also a national welcome. I'll start with the two texts that we read from the Old Testament and the New Testament this morning, and after diving into them a little bit, discuss in a little bit more detail the work that we do at Action Réfugiés Montréal. And just to let you know, I'm drawing some inspiration from three books that talk a lot about this subject. And there's, a number of really intelligent people who have written about refuge and what the Bible has to say about that. One is Mark Glanville and Luke Glanville. They are, Mark Glanville is a professor at Regent College in Vancouver. His brother Luke is they're both Australian, from Australia. And they wrote this wonderful book, Refuge Reimagined, that I really draw on a lot. And they dig into what scriptures have to say about welcoming strangers to our community. They have a really deep knowledge of the Bible that comes through in this book, and hopefully some of what they've written will inspire what I say today. And their approach is kind of like, what is a theology of welcome? Looking at the Bible really as a whole to see what can we pull from different texts throughout the scriptures and tell us how to welcome people. Two other books that focus more on specific stories in the Bible that I also really like give us inspiration on how to welcome newcomers. So one book, The Encounters, originally was written in Korean by Haren Kim Craig and Eunyeon Choi. A really great book that explores specific stories in the Bible and tells us in more detail how this can inspire us today. And then a book called The God Who Belongs by Karen Gonzalez, an American who talks a lot about her journey coming, I think, from Mexico. It's been a couple years since I read it, to the United States, and weaving that in with biblical narratives and different stories that we read in the Bible. So as I was preparing this morning, I felt I had two choices. One would be to talk of a specific story from the biblical text, maybe the story of Ruth, the Good Samaritan, the Syrophoenician woman, the refugee narrative of Mary, Joseph, and Jesus, or other stories. Or I could look, and maybe I took the more boring approach, I apologize in advance, but we could look at some of the teachings and the instructions in the Bible that are very clear, and then kind of weave that into understanding how that impacts us on a personal level. So as the scripture readings indicated, I focused on some of the more instructive texts from the Bible, but using inspiration from these three books and the Bible itself to remind us how and when these instructions can be lived out or used in our daily lives. So let's dive into the text from Deuteronomy. This book, Deuteronomy, includes a long list of instructions on right living, instructions from God to God's people as they wandered from a long period in exile, living in displacement, to a new land. And in Deuteronomy, we have an account from Moses of these instructions, how people should live, instructions for a nation. And let's just read again that text, focusing, starting in verse 17. For the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome, who shows no partiality and accepts no bribes. God defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow, and loves the foreigner residing among you, giving them food and clothing. And you are to love those who are foreigners, for you yourselves were foreigners in Egypt. So as God's people are on the move, having just experienced this lengthy period of living in a difficult period, there's a clear instruction that says, do not forget what you have just gone through, and remember to be generous to the people that you encounter in a new land, because you have lived this yourself. These are not the only instructions in the book of Deuteronomy concerning how to treat foreigners. If we read on and looked through the whole book, there's all types of different commands or instructions in different categories, we might even say. So Deuteronomy 24, employment laws, and I'm paraphrasing here, but it says, do not oppress the needy and destitute hired laborer. Even if a stranger who is in your land, even if they are a stranger, you shall give them their wage for the day. Treat people fairly, even if they're not from your group of people. Later on in the same chapter, supposedly, this is speaking to farmers, of course, suppose you accidentally leave behind a sheaf in the field. Don't return to get it. It shall be for the stranger. Earlier on in the book of Deuteronomy, hear disputes and judge fairly, whether a case between brother Israelites or between one of them and an alien. Create a justice system that doesn't privilege your own people, but listens fairly to someone from away as well. There's a lot of talk in the book of Deuteronomy about feasts and celebrations. Celebrate with the Levite, celebrate with the stranger who is in your midst. Create a big table and invite everyone to join. On sharing resources, Deuteronomy 14, bring tithes to ensure that the aliens, fatherless, and widows who live in your towns may come and eat and be satisfied. So, to summarize, in the Old Testament book of Deuteronomy, we have clear instructions about how to treat those from outside our community. And these passages call for, whether you call them strangers or foreigners, les étrangers, aliens, different versions of the Bible use a different term, calls for fairness in employment, access to food, justice and fair processes, sharing together and celebrating with each other. And if we continue reading the Old Testament text, we could go to the book of Ruth, where we hear, your people shall be my people, taking food provided and nourishing one another, celebrating together, feeling welcome in a new land. There are parts of the Old Testament that make us maybe think, well, this seems like a wonderful vision, but we still know that there are conflicts between people or challenging moments in the Old Testament text. Sometimes the violence in the Old Testament can be shocking. But what we do see is when it's a question of someone who is not getting access to rights or seeking protection, there is a clear call towards welcome, treating people fairly and with justice. So the God of the Old Testament in the passage in Deuteronomy relays a message through Moses about expanding welcome, providing hospitality, and being intentional about providing for those in need. And these authors, Mark Glanville and Luke Glanville, they are brothers, have the following comment to say about this. They say, according to Deuteronomy, Israel has no right to come before God for worship unless the stranger is standing alongside them. There's a strong sense that the stranger purifies Israel. And then they move to the present and they say, Christ followers today must take this requirement for worship with utmost seriousness. God may only rightly be approached alongside the stranger who is being enfolded within the community. This is right worship, according to Deuteronomy. So if you read this book closely, which is exposing what the Bible has to say to us, they focus on how our understanding of kinship or our understanding of family, of the relationships that we build around us, is to be extended, welcoming, and inclusive when we look closely at what the Bible has to say. So with this in mind, let's move forward to the Gospels. And again, I could have chosen to give you a number of parables or stories and specific instances to really illustrate this. And maybe I'll just mention a few of them. And these are stories I'm sure you're familiar with. We know that Jesus frequently, maybe almost too often, according to the people who were around him, Jesus frequently ate meals and conversed with individuals who were different from him. He had a reputation of spending time with those who were shunned by others in society, causing some trouble and being disruptive. Jesus focused on justice and compassion more than he focused on following laws strictly. When the Pharisees were providing strict rules on ritual purity, Jesus focused on the broader requirement of acting justly and loving mercy. And for example, when Jesus healed lepers or people with other sicknesses or ailments who were cast out of the community, Jesus welcomed these individuals back into the fold, back into the community, setting right what had been broken or separated. His model extends compassion and welcome to all people, even if they do not end up following him. There were times where he healed individuals who did not return to him, from what we read in the gospel, to say thank you, but he still took time to make the situation right. There are more stories with teachings for us. The parable of the Good Samaritan, where Jesus asks, who was his neighbor? And it was, his neighbor was the one who provided for him. Jesus says, go and do likewise. The Samaritan provided for the man who was injured of his own means. He took what he had and made the situation right. And Jesus' command, go and do likewise. Jesus set up an example of supporting someone from outside their community with your own means. So these examples bring us to the gospel reading for today. Jesus is speaking to his followers, providing instructions on, or explaining a bit the final judgment. And this passage provides a really moving identification. Jesus sets himself as being like those with great, great need. I'll read it again for you. The righteous will answer him, Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you? And the king will answer them, truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it for me. Now, when Jesus says, the least of these who are members of my family, or the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did it for me, This is not just saying, for me, because we know from Jesus' teachings, his healing and his actions were for people even beyond the community that he was from, right? He opens up the circle of who's included in this close compassion beyond what we even saw in the Old Testament, even further pushing beyond to say, let's create a society of welcome and of acceptance. So I want to connect these passages and teachings to the work that we do at Action Réfugiés Montreal. In the early 1990s, a Presbyterian minister named Glynis Williams was working and visiting individuals who were detained because maybe they had problems with their immigration documentation or something like this. And a circle, a community that kind of surrounded her, including Anglicans, Presbyterians, some Jewish individuals, maybe people who didn't have any explicit faith or regular practice, formed together to create Action Réfugiés Montréal. The Anglican Diocese, the Presbyterian Church, from the beginning said, we are committed to this work and to this mission. And from the beginning, the focus was on welcoming individuals who are living in places of other regions of the world who need refugee protection, providing support to vulnerable individuals here in Montreal, focusing on vulnerability and particularly on women, and then thinking about education and advocacy, not just providing individual supports, but changing more broadly how things are working in society. So these main program areas have remained consistent. Sponsoring refugees is something we continue to be involved in. Visiting the detention center, which is now located in Laval. We have staff who go there on a regular basis. And creating programs and spaces for social inclusion is another main aspect of our programs. We have a short video where you don't just see me talking about this, but a couple of my colleagues. And if everything works, I think we'll see it right now. Hello, I'm Ian, the Executive Director of Action Réfugiés Montréal. I'm delighted to introduce you to the work that we do. As our name suggests, our programs focus on helping individuals seeking protection in Canada, individuals who are leaving behind dangerous situations or who have fled persecution in their country of origin.
Through the Quebec Refugee Sponsorship Program, Action Réfugiés Montréal works closely with Montrealers to sponsor their family members living in situations of forced migration overseas.
When sponsored refugees arrive in Quebec, we accompany them for 12 months as they adapt to their new life.
We make sure they are well equipped and informed, and we offer them the support they need to overcome obstacles, succeed their first year, and continue to build their new life.
In Canada, federal law allows for the administrative detention of non-citizens for various immigration reasons. Action Réfugiés Montréal provides support to people detained at the Laval Immigration Holding Centre, one of 3 immigration detention centres in Canada.
We are the only local organization with access to common areas inside the center where we meet with people and offer our support. We give special attention to people seeking protection as well as people with vulnerabilities.
The twinning program offers opportunity to refuged women who recently arrived in Montreal and Montreal women to meet up, exchange culture, tradition, experience, and story of life. Through this program, the grain of a true and authentic friendship is established between 2 women who otherwise would have never crossed paths. Through individual twinning and group activities that we run on a monthly basis, we try to promote and build an inclusive and supportive community that values differences and equality and hopes for a Canada for all.
We receive no government support for our core programs. Each of these programs is possible thanks to generous support from you and other donors.
Our team uses our frontline expertise in supporting individuals seeking protection in Canada to advocate for change and inform people eager to learn more about refugee issues. We are a local organization that has a national impact thanks to our participation in advocacy and educational initiatives.
Thank you for your support and your interest in our work.
Finished these videos a couple weeks ago, and So, c'est aussi disponible en français. Si vous préférez voir une vidéo en français, on a fait la même chose. And we also did kind of more in-depth videos of each of our specific programs that are available on our YouTube channel. Now, my goal here is not to say, look, the Bible suggests that we be welcoming, and I'm the executive director of a welcoming organization. We're good to go. Look, we've figured things out at our place. No, not at all. There's a lot of improvements that we could do, and often one of the challenges that we have at our organization is feeling limited in the impact that we're able to have. We also, we want to inspire broader kind of change and also local initiatives that happen in a variety of spaces. So what we find in our work at Action Réfugiés Montréal is that it's so inspiring to see initiatives from the past that we've observed, congregations involved in refugee sponsorship, diverse communities that worship together, are welcoming and inclusive, looking at the present, how congregations explore new initiatives, and the future of how to extend welcome and kind of be open to one another. That's maybe more kind of on an individual level, what can occur, but I think it provides us evidence and helps to support broader change. So this is me putting on maybe my sociology graduate student hat a little bit, but when we have seen in our history in Quebec or in Canada, big movements to welcome newcomers, whether it's individuals from Southeast Asia, like the Vietnamese in the late 1970s or early 1980s, welcoming Syrian refugees a few years ago, or Afghan and Ukrainian refugees these days, what that is built on is kind of a broad movement of support. If there are a number of congregations that say, I want to help refugees, then when the next election happens, political parties say, we should propose platforms that are more welcoming and more inclusive, right? And so each individual action, I think, helps to transform our society on a broader level to be more inclusive. And when we look at the biblical text that I've shared today, you shall also love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Or, truly I tell you, whatever you do for the least of these brothers and sisters, you do for me. I think we can be encouraged to move forward. I think I'll just share two very brief stories of my own work experience, and this is before I started working at Action Réfugiés Montréal. As I mentioned, grew up in Alberta. My grandparents immigrated to Canada from the Netherlands, seeking a bit of a brighter future or better opportunities. But I grew up in a fairly homogenous community, didn't know so many people from other places. I got hired to work for the government, and then I did some training. I spent 2 months in Pakistan in 2010. And in Islamabad, when you go to maybe like the equivalent of Costco or, I don't know, big grocery store, the one that we would go to quite often was just across the road from a huge refugee camp full of Afghan refugees. And I just remember thinking, what if I had grown up where when I have to buy my groceries, I would see thousands of people living in huts and shacks because that's the only thing that's available to them. They've been, forced to flee from their home country. This is the situation you're in now. We see poverty and issues in Canada. We know that there are challenges in our own society and country, but when you encounter it kind of in a different context and see the size of the need in certain situations, I think it changes us. And I'm sure that many of you have experiences like this as well, or have been places where it hits you and you think, we are so blessed living in Canada compared to some other situations. In 2016, when I was working in South Africa, my job was to implement Canadian immigration legislation, and it can be very difficult for individuals to come to Canada, particularly who come from poorer countries with less resources. We have a whole system that is built to prevent people from coming to this country that some of you probably are quite familiar with because of your family members, and others might not encounter very much at all. But I went to a refugee camp in rural Zimbabwe, and I was interviewing refugees to come to Canada, and met a man who was, I think, in his 70s, a grandfather. And in my interview, he said, well, yeah, I left my country in 1973. This was, 53 years later, I think, no, 43 years later. And he said, I haven't been back since, and I've just been waiting for something a little bit more permanent than this refugee camp that I've been living in. And that was rewarding because that was the case where Canada was welcoming this person to come here. But as I left, the translators that I worked with all week long, they said, make sure you're coming back for us because we would also like to have something better than this refugee camp that we're living in. And I just, that stays in my head, the need on an international level. Something else I could have done this morning, and this is what I do a bit at the course I teach at Concordia, is talk about all of these statistics and information and what the global need is versus what's happening in Quebec. Sometimes people say, oh, we can't handle things here. If you look at how wealthy we are and how rich we are compared to other parts of the world, I think we could do a lot more. And as people of faith and people committed to justice, think about local initiatives motivated by Scripture, I think it also can lead to a broader change. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian, so much. So we are grateful for your words and your message this morning. Now, those 3 books that you showed us earlier, we have a weekly news email to our congregation. We'll put those 3 books in there so that anyone interested can access them through the Pulse. And so we're going to open up the floor now for any comments, thoughts, or questions. Fiona.
Thank you. Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you so much. Just to start out, I really agree. I think we could be doing so much more. A few of us work in the homeless sector in Montreal, and one of the very worrying trends that we've seen in the last year especially is a growing number of refugees and asylum seekers showing up in the homeless system in Montreal. And it breaks my heart that people are leaving, as you say, to come to a better place. And because of the conjoncture with the housing crisis, there's nowhere to live. And so, what's your take on how we can, yes, continue to welcome people, but not introduce them to a life of worse misery?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I think people who are making decisions to come here are coming here because they know it's going to be something better for them, right? And so we can create systems and invest in certain ways to create support for them. I think you can't really blame someone who's seeking protection for the actions that they're making, but we can look at how our society is set up to, not have enough funding for housing or not have enough supports provided. It's tricky, and I think there's a bunch of advocates within the immigration sector who have talked about how the welcome that is provided has to be, sufficiently resourced or compassionate. I'm trying to remember, they had a catchphrase that they were using, but now it's like left my head or something. I'll try and find it. But we have to have adequate kind of investments in systems, and sometimes, and this is a very political statement that I'm going to make, but there can be, for individuals who are opposed to immigration, a benefit. If you don't create a system that welcomes people, then everyone thinks things are broken and we can't handle it, therefore we have to say no. But you allowed the system to become broken so that public opinion would turn against individuals seeking protection. I think that's what happens sometimes. We can chat more. I'll maybe have a more thorough response after I've reflected on this a bit.
I just want to thank you for accepting the invitation from our priest, because I must give kudos to the Reverend. He always introduced the congregation to different things that in life, in society, what's going on, and so on and so forth. So I just want to say that, because we don't only hear his voice on Sundays, we hear from others, even members from the congregation. And I must say, kudos to our priest.
Thank you, Mina. I would get pretty bored listening to me every Sunday. So thank you, Ian, for rescuing the congregation from hearing me too many Sundays in a row.
And
Christine and then Sarah. Yeah. So go ahead.
What I would have loved to do is bring some of my colleagues with me as well. Yes, but you saw them briefly on video.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for your talk. I just wondered, what is the average time a refugee might be incarcerated in a detention center, and what happens to them when they leave?
There can be a big variation in how long individuals are detained. So sometimes they show up at the border and the border officials say, you don't have quite the right documents, we're unsure who you are. We've spent, as an organization, over $9,000 this year on phone cards. Because so they put them, the CBSA, the Canada Border Services Agency, puts individuals in detention and then doesn't let them make international phone calls. So we buy them phone cards, so they call their family in whatever region of the world, and they say, I need some documentation and information, and then once that's provided, often they are released. Now, there's a variety of situations that lead to people being detained. Sometimes it can be criminal activity that's occurred in Canada or other issues. If identity documents are not proved quickly, it can really stretch out. So I don't have a clear answer for you on the length. My colleague Jenny knows a lot more. And Andre actually was chatting with Jenny about this a bit too and visited the detention center and saw it a bit as well. No, the detention center in Laval is more focused on when the government has met someone that has questions about their situation. Right. Slow processing times are a big issue in refugee sponsorship. And actually, I'm going with some colleagues to the National Assembly on Tuesday to talk as part of their hearings at the legislature about immigration levels in Quebec, to advocate for you need to speed up these processes where individuals, maybe Afghans living in Tajikistan, have been waiting for years and years to come to Canada. And we've already said, oh, we're going to accept you to come here, but then they're just putting the brakes on it. And so that's where we're really trying to push and say, we need to speed up these processes.
Right. Yeah. Just before we go to Sarah, Andre, can you just tell us a word about your involvement with Action Réfugiés?
Thank you, Jan, for coming here and sharing everything there. We as CMP are seeking to be part of this welcoming answer for the refugees. So we are trying to find ways that we can serve this refugee community, especially here in Ville Saint-Laurent. There are many coming to live here as well. And one of the things that took me closer to ARM, it is actually the visitation from the detention center. Yeah. So if we could be part of that and help there, and especially be the ones that could be part helping those when they come outside to go and walk along with them. And so one of maybe the questions we have been asking ourselves during this past year, and I say ourselves as Chris and the leadership team and the staff, it is, how can we be serving this community? How can we put our building and our talents and people that are here in place to answer this demanding need and people who are coming? So this is basically.
Yeah. Thank you, Andre.
Can I add two things briefly? One, in the video you probably saw that we're kind of in a church building, right? So our physical offices are located at St. Jacques in downtown Montreal. That's where our location is. And so Selena, when she was speaking, was in the sanctuary of St. Jacques. And the other thing is Andre has been a very big help for us. And yesterday we had a large fundraising event that was held at Epiphany Church in Verdun, which is very close to where I live, actually, with Reverend Amy Hamilton. And we had about 140 people there for a fundraising event, and Andre was there, and Ed was there, and some of your friends from the Francisation course that you were in, and that was really wonderful to have so much support, and it was a really fun day. But I kind of, if my voice is a little bit hoarse, it's because I was shouting a lot yesterday at that event.
That's great. So Sarah, and then last comment to Ansa.
Thank you. I have three kind of factual questions. Who are your partners, or who do you collaborate with? Yeah. Can we refer people to you, or do you work with pre-established relationships or sponsorships? And what kind of volunteer opportunities are there, or that you might be looking for?
Yeah, great, thanks. So our partners are We can look at this in different ways, like the Anglican Diocese and the Presbyterian Church. And so if there are churches that want to be involved in specific initiatives, that's definitely part of my role, is to help facilitate and mobilize that if it's in refugee sponsorship or in other work. Our access to the detention center is based off of an agreement with the Canada Border Services Agency. So sometimes we criticize them because we say you should be more humane and more just, but we also work with them in order to provide the services that we do within the center. And then we receive funding from community foundations, organizations, donors. We're members of the Table de Concertation des Organismes Réfugiés et Immigrants au Québec, so we work in coalition with a lot of other immigrant and refugee serving organizations, and also Jenny, one of my colleagues, is the vice president of the Canadian Council for Refugees, which is an umbrella organization with, I think, 200 members in Canada, and so we're quite involved at that level as well. Referrals, in the detention program, we provide support to individuals who are there. In the sponsorship program, if there's congregations who are interested in sponsorship initiatives, I would love to talk about it. And in our twinning program and programs for social inclusion, we prioritize individuals who have been detained, but then also work with PRIDA, social workers, and other kind of healthcare organizations to identify vulnerable women in particular, to have them become part of our programs. And I'm also happy to chat with anyone if someone's working in that area. For volunteers, our twinning program includes volunteers. So for women, we're looking for volunteers to get involved in new friendships and kind of community connections. And then we have occasional other events, like our fundraiser yesterday, where we have a call for volunteers. But we're not, like there's some other organizations that have a warehouse with furniture that they provide to individuals. That would be Welcome Collective. We don't have a large program like that, so we sometimes refer people who are looking for volunteering to Welcome Collective, who we also have a very close relationship with.
All right, thank you, and Ansa.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup. En fait, cette semaine, ça a été tombé très bien, votre sermon d'aujourd'hui. Et puis, j'ai écouté l'émission à la Radio-Canada cette semaine sur l'émission Facture. Et puis, ça parle de réfugiés, l'exploitation des réfugiés ou demandeurs d'asile dans nos champs, là. C'est comme eux, ils recrutent vraiment, quelqu'un recrute vraiment les réfugiés ou demandeurs d'asile ou même les immigrants. Ouais. Ils les exploitent dans les champs vraiment. Mais ce sont ces gens-là qui nous donnent à manger après le résultat. Ce que je veux en venir, en fait, c'est que au-delà d'accompagner les réfugiés ou les demandeurs d'asile, est-ce que vous faites des actions par rapport aux exploitations des immigrants, surtout dans les fermes, là?
Oui, donc on ne fait pas d'action nous-mêmes chez Action Réfugiés Montréal concernant cet enjeu-là, mais nos amis qui travaillent à la mission communautaire de Montréal font un grand projet de recherche sur les expériences des travailleurs immigrants à Montréal. Maybe if I also add in English, so it is a big issue, the exploitation and unfair treatment of migrant labor. And we can even say, like Deuteronomy is telling us, have a fair legal system that supports everyone. That is not the situation that's happening here right now. Our programs have not focused so much on supporting these types of issues, but we work in partnership and coalition with organizations like Montreal City Mission, and Justice for Migrant Workers, other organizations that really bring this to the forefront. So, merci.
Great. Ian, thank you very much. We're very grateful for you joining us this morning.
Thank you.
And Ian will be available after the service. So I invite you to please stand, and we will confess our faith as we say the words of the Apostles' Creed. I believe in God, the Father Almighty,